At 77 years old, Agnes Holt had already survived the worst things life could take from a person. She'd buried a husband. She'd learned to be alone. She'd made peace with a quiet life in a 3-room apartment that held 31 years of memory in its walls. What she hadn't survived yet, what she was still fighting every other Sunday over tea and biscuits and careful silences, was her own daughter's certainty that Agnes was finished. Clare had already chosen the nursing home, already looked up what the apartment might sell for. She left the paperwork on the counter like a verdict. She never said the word burden out loud. She didn't need to. And then, a letter arrived from a law office in a town Agnes had never heard of, informing her that a distant relative she barely knew, an army engineer who had lived alone his entire life, had died at 89 and left her everything he had. Not money, not furniture, just land. 1.4 acres of nothing in the middle of nowhere, assessed at $4,000. Claire laughed when she read it. "Congratulations, Mom, you own a field." Agnes drove out to see it anyway. 3 hours east on a grey November morning, alone, the way she did most things now, she found overgrown grass, bare birch trees, cold sky. Claire had been right. There was nothing there. But then Agnes's boot pressed down through the leaves and hit something that wasn't earth. Something flat, something metal. She cleared the leaves with her hands and found a hatch sealed into the ground, stamped with a date, 1978. And below it, 8 concrete steps leading into a silence that had been waiting there for decades. What Agnes found at the bottom of those steps would stun a Cold War historian, a preservation specialist, and eventually a documentary crew. What it was worth, no one in her life had imagined. And on the table in the room at the far end, there was an envelope, sealed, with her name on it, written in a stranger's careful hand. He had known about her for her entire life, and he had spent 11 years building her a fortress. You are here for a reason. Together, we'll reveal what someone tried to hide. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment wherever you're watching. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Agnes cleaned the bathroom. She found it wedged between a gas bill and a supermarket flyer, the envelope thicker than usual, printed on heavy cream paper with a return address she didn't recognize. She set it on the kitchen table and finished cleaning the bathroom first. At 77 years old, Agnes Holt had learned that unexpected things were rarely worth rushing toward. Her daughter Clare had been coming every other Sunday for the past 4 months, and the visits had stopped feeling like visits sometime around the 3rd one. They felt more like inspections. Claire would walk through the apartment with that particular expression she'd developed since turning 50. A tight, evaluating look, eyes moving across surfaces, checking for dust, for disorder, for evidence that her mother was failing in some measurable way. The apartment was 3 rooms in a building on the east side of the city, the same apartment where Agnes had lived for 31 years, where she had nursed her husband Walter through his final winter, where she had learned to cook for one and eventually stopped minding it. The apartment was fine. Agnes was fine. But Claire had decided otherwise sometime last spring. And once Claire decided something, the deciding had a way of becoming everyone else's reality. The nursing home Claire had found was called Sunrise Gardens. Agnes had looked it up online after the first mention, sitting at the same kitchen table where she now held the cream envelope, and had read the reviews with the careful attention she gave to everything. The reviews were not terrible. The food was described as adequate. The staff were described as mostly kind. The rooms were described as compact, which Agnes understood to mean small. There was a shared lounge with a television that was, according to one reviewer, always too loud. Walter had died in this apartment, in their bed, with Agnes's hand in his and the window open, because he had loved the sound of the street below. She was not going to end her life watching a too loud television in a compact room at Sunrise Gardens. But Claire had already made calls, already gotten cost estimates, already spoken, apparently, to someone about the apartment, Not about selling it, not yet, but about what it might be worth in the current market. Agnes had found a printed real estate comparison on the kitchen counter during one of the Sunday visits, left there the way you leave something when you want it found, but don't want to admit you left it. She hadn't said anything. She had made tea and brought out the biscuits Clare liked, and they had talked about Clare's daughter's school recital, and neither of them had mentioned the paper on the counter, and it had stayed there between them like a stone. Agnes opened the cream envelope with a kitchen knife. The letter inside was from a law office in a town called Varnfield, 3 hours east, and it informed her in careful, impersonal language that a man named Edouard Sorel had died on the 14th of last month at the age of 89, without a surviving spouse, without children, and without named beneficiaries other than one, Agnes Louise Holt, née Prentice, of this address. Edouard Sorel, the letter explained, had been the grandson of Agnes's maternal great-uncle, which made him something on the order of a second cousin once removed. The letter noted that Agnes may not have been personally acquainted with the deceased. It also noted that the estate consisted of a single asset, a parcel of land in the Varnfield district, approximately 1.4 acres, undeveloped, with no structures of record. Agnes read the letter twice. Then she poured herself a second cup of tea and read it a third time. She had heard the name Edward Sorel exactly once in her life, at a family gathering in the 1980s, when an aunt had mentioned a cousin who had gone into the military and then gone peculiar and moved somewhere east and never married. Agnes could not remember what the aunt had said after that. She could remember the tone, the particular tone people used for relatives who had made choices no one quite understood. She called the law office the following morning. A woman named Patricia answered and confirmed the details. The land was in Agnes's name as of the date of death. Property taxes had been paid through the end of the current year, so there was no immediate obligation. The land itself was assessed at approximately $4,000. It was wooded on 2 sides and open on the third. There were no active utilities. There was nothing on it. Agnes thanked Patricia and wrote down the address of the parcel, which Patricia read out slowly and spelled twice. Clare came that Sunday. Agnes put the letter on the table between them without explanation and watched her daughter read it. Clare's expression moved through several stages: confusion, a kind of amused skepticism, and then something that settled into the bright, careful look she used when she was trying to be tactful about something she found absurd. "So you inherited land," Clare said. "It appears so." "In Varnfield." Clare looked at the letter again. "Mom, I had to look up where Varnfield even is. It's the middle of nowhere." "There's nothing out there." "I know. 1.4 acres of nothing, assessed at $4,000. Clare set the letter down with the gentle precision of someone handling something fragile and slightly ridiculous. "Congratulations, Mom. You own a field." Agnes poured the tea. "Well," Clare continued, "I suppose we can look into selling it, though I'm not sure who's buying 1.4 acres of wooded nothing in Varnfield County. Probably worth less than the legal fees." She reached for a biscuit. "It's a sweet thought, I suppose. Strange man leaving you a field." Agnes said nothing. "It doesn't change anything," Clare added, more quietly. "We should still talk about the apartment, about the plan. I spoke with the director at Sunrise Gardens again on Thursday, and they have an opening coming up in March, which is actually very good timing." "I'd like to see it," Agnes said. Clare paused. "See what?" "The land. I'd like to go and see it." The look Clare gave her was the one Agnes had been seeing more frequently. Not unkind, not angry, but weighted with a particular exhaustion, as if Agnes's continued insistence on existing as a person with preferences was something that required management. "Mom, it's 3 hours away, and there's nothing to see." "Then it won't take long." Agnes picked up her cup. "I'll drive out on Wednesday." Clare opened her mouth and closed it again. They both knew Agnes still drove. They both knew that Agnes driving was something Clare had opinions about, but had not yet converted into prohibitions, and that Agnes intended to keep it that way as long as she possibly could. "I'll be back by evening," Agnes said. "I'll call you when I'm home." On Wednesday morning, Agnes packed a thermos of coffee, a sandwich, a pair of old gardening gloves she found in the hall closet, and drove east on a grey November morning with the address written on a card tucked above the dashboard. The road to Warnfield became less certain the farther east she drove. The highway gave way to county roads. The county roads gave way to something narrower and paler, lined with bare November trees that pressed close on both sides. Agnes followed the directions she'd written out longhand the night before, checking them at each intersection, and found the turnoff 40 minutes past the last town of any size, a gravel track marked only by a rusted green post with no sign attached. She pulled in slowly. The car moved over uneven ground, gravel thinning to dirt, and stopped where the track ended at a low wooden gate secured with a chain and a padlock. The key had come with a letter from the law office, a small brass key in a paper envelope. Agnes got out, unlocked the padlock with some effort. It was stiff, salt-rusted, the kind of lock that had not been opened in years, and pushed the gate inward. It moved reluctantly, dragging through a season's worth of dead leaves. Beyond the gate was a field, though field was a generous word for it. It was an expanse of rough ground, perhaps 40 meters wide, overgrown with tall grass gone brown and brittle in the cold, bordered on the far end by a dense stand of birch trees that had shed most of their leaves. The open ground was lumpy and uneven, as if whatever had once been here had been removed imperfectly, leaving the earth disturbed and unsettled. A few wild shrubs had taken hold near the center. Weeds had colonized the rest. Agnes stood at the gate for a moment and looked at it. A field and some trees. Clare had been correct about that much. She walked in slowly, hands in her coat pockets, the dry grass crackling under her boots. The sky was low and white. There was no sound except the occasional movement in the birch trees, a bird or just the wind. She walked the perimeter first, the way she approached any new place, methodically, taking in the edges before the middle. The ground was harder under the grass than she expected, as if the soil had been compacted at some point long ago. Along the far border near the trees, she found the remnants of a path, not a proper path, but a subtle depression in the earth where someone had walked the same route repeatedly over many years. She followed it. The path led from the tree line toward the center left of the field, where 3 old shrubs formed a rough triangle around a slightly lower section of ground. The depression was small, perhaps 2 meters across, partially filled with leaves and debris from several seasons of autumn. Agnes stepped into it, and the ground shifted slightly under her left boot. She stopped. She pressed her boot down again, carefully. There was give beneath the leaf layer, but then something solid underneath. Not earth, not stone. A different resistance. A flatness that the surrounding ground didn't have. Agnes crouched, which her knees objected to, and pulled off the gardening gloves and put them on properly. She began moving leaves aside with both hands, working outward from where her boot had pressed. The leaves were wet underneath, matted together, and came away in clumps. Below them was soil, a thin layer of it, and below the soil was metal. Cold, dull, dark gray. A surface, not a pipe or a post. A surface. She cleared more of it, expanding outward in each direction, until she could see the shape. A rectangle, approximately 1 meter by 1.5, set flush into the earth, with 2 hinges visible on one side and a recessed pull handle on the other. A hatch. An actual hatch set into the ground, sealed into a concrete surround that extended several centimeters above the surrounding earth and had been deliberately buried. Agnes sat back on her heels and looked at it. Stamped into the metal near the hinges, in characters that were still legible despite the rust and weathering, was a date. 1978. She gripped the pull handle with both hands and lifted. the hatch did not move. She repositioned, got her weight behind it, and tried again. This time there was a groan of metal, a sound like something very old being asked to remember its purpose. And then it came, slowly, heavily, swinging upward on hinges that protested every centimeter but did not fail. Agnes held it open and looked down. Concrete steps, 8 of them, leading into darkness. The smell that came up was dry and metallic and strangely clean, nothing like the mildew she'd expected. Dry. Whatever was down there, it had been built to stay dry. She went back to the car and got the flashlight she kept in the glove box. She stood at the top of the steps for a moment, shining the beam downward. The steps were solid. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and uncracked. At the bottom, the beam found the floor and the edge of what looked like a door frame. She went down. The lower room was larger than she had anticipated from above, perhaps 6 meters long and 4 wide, with a ceiling of just under 2 meters, enough to stand in without stooping. The walls were concrete throughout, reinforced by metal struts at regular intervals. Against the left wall stood metal shelving units, still loaded, sealed containers in uniform rows, some plastic, some metal, labels handwritten in careful block letters. Water purification tablets, dried goods, medical supplies. The dates on the labels ranged from the 1980s to 2011. Someone had been restocking this for decades. Against the far wall was a generator, old but substantial, bolted to a low concrete platform. Beside it, 2 large fuel canisters. Above the generator, wiring ran along the ceiling and disappeared through a conduit into the second wall. Agnes followed it with the flashlight beam and found, mounted in the corner, a bank of batteries and a panel with switches she didn't understand. A second door, this one metal, stood in the right-hand wall. Agnes pushed it open and found a second level, not deeper, but further back, cut into the earth horizontally, perhaps 3 meters below the level of the field outside. It was smaller, more personal. There was an armchair, once good quality. The fabric faded to an indistinct green. Beside it, a standing lamp connected to a power strip. A bookshelf built directly into the concrete, filled with books in careful order. Engineering texts, military history, geography, and, on the bottom shelf, a long run of paperback novels, their spines worn with reading. A small table with a folding chair. On the table, a shortwave radio, a manual typewriter, a clean glass ashtray with no ash in it, and a tin cup. Agnes stood in the doorway of this room for a long time. On the wall above the bookshelf, pinned with a small nail, was a photograph. A woman in her 30s or early 40s, standing in front of a garden gate, squinting slightly in summer sunlight. Agnes stepped closer and looked at the face. She recognized no one, but the garden gate in the photograph was unmistakably familiar. Wrought iron, with a scroll design at the top, the same gate that had stood at her mother's house in the county where Agnes had grown up, removed sometime in the 1990s when the property was sold. Her hands had gone very still. On the table, beneath the tin cup, there was an envelope. Not the cream-colored legal envelope from the law office. Something older, handmade looking, the flaps sealed and then sealed again with a strip of tape that had yellowed at the edges. Written across the front in the same careful block letters she had seen on the supply labels, in ink that had not faded, Agnes Louise Holt. She sat down in Edouard Sorel's armchair and opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten, dated March of 2019. The handwriting was precise and slanted slightly to the left. "I have known about you since you were born," it began. "Your mother and my grandmother were close as girls, and when my grandmother died, she left me her letters. And in those letters you appeared over and over, first as a baby, and then as a child, and then as a young woman making her life. I never reached out. I was not the sort of man who reaches out. I was the sort of man who builds things and keeps them to himself. I built this because I was certain the world would end. I spent 11 years building it, from 1973 to 1984. And then I spent the next 30 years maintaining it and waiting. The world did not end. It just continued badly, the way it always has. I am 87 years old now, and I've decided that I would rather leave something useful to someone specific than let this become a legal curiosity after I am gone. You have survived things, Agnes. I know something about your life, more than you might find comfortable. I believe you will know what to do with a place that belongs entirely to you. I built it so that one person could be safe. It is yours now. Do with it what you will. Edward. Agnes read the letter twice, sitting in a dead man's armchair, 8 steps below a field in Varnfield County, with the flashlight balanced on her knee and the shortwave radio silent beside her. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She sat for another few minutes in the quiet. There was no sound from above. No wind reached down here. The air was dry and still, and temperature-controlled in a way she couldn't entirely account for, as if the mass of earth above had simply decided on a temperature and maintained it out of habit. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and went back up the steps to the surface, pulling the hatch shut behind her with both hands. She stood in the cold field for a moment, looking at the birch trees at the far edge, at the low white sky, at the unremarkable grass bending in the wind. Then she walked back to the car, poured coffee from the thermos, and ate her sandwich. She was going to need a proper flashlight, better boots, a work lamp, and something to treat the hatch hinges so they opened without that sound. She would look into solar panels. She had read an article about them the previous spring, the kind of reading she did when Clare mentioned the apartment and she needed to think about something else entirely. She pulled out her phone and began making a list. She came back the following Saturday with a proper work lamp, a can of WD-40, a wire brush, and a notebook. She came back the Saturday after that with a portable battery pack, a set of basic tools she'd bought from a hardware store on the edge of the city, and a thermal flask large enough to last a full day. By the third Saturday, she had stopped thinking of it as coming back and started thinking of it simply as going, the way you go somewhere that has become a regular part of the shape of your week. The hinges stopped protesting by the end of November. The hatch opened cleanly after that, the way it had been designed to, the weight of it balanced precisely enough that a single hand was sufficient once the mechanism was freed. Eduard had built it that way deliberately, she understood. He had thought about a person arriving alone. She worked methodically. She catalogued the supplies on the shelving units first, recording each item in the notebook with the date printed on the label and a brief note on condition. Most of the sealed containers were still good. The dried goods she set aside as uncertain. The medical supplies were largely intact. The water purification equipment was functional, or would be once connected to a water source, which she added to the notebook's growing list. The generator she left alone for the first month, unwilling to attempt something mechanical without understanding it properly. She found the manual in a plastic sleeve tucked behind the fuel canisters, typed, not printed, with handwritten corrections in the margins, the kind of document a man produces when he knows he is the only person who will ever read it. She read it over 2 visits and understood enough. The solar panels took research she conducted at the kitchen table in the evenings, reading articles and then reading the articles those articles linked to, the way she had always learned things, not quickly, but thoroughly, without shortcuts. She contacted 3 companies before finding one whose representative, a young man named Daniel, spoke to her without the slightly elevated volume and slowed cadence that some people used when speaking to women of her age. Daniel assessed the land in early December, walking the open ground with a measuring device and a tablet computer, and told her what she needed. The installation took 1 day in January, 2 men working efficiently in the cold, the panels mounted on a low frame positioned to avoid the shadow of the birch trees. By the end of January, the batteries in the bunker held a charge. The lamp in Edward's reading room worked. Agnes sat in his armchair that evening with the lamp on and read 20 pages of one of his paperback novels. It was not very good, but she appreciated that he had kept it. She had not told Clare about any of it. This was not a decision she had made consciously. It was more that each time she had considered mentioning it, something had stopped her. Not strategy, not calculation, but a simpler instinct. The knowledge that certain things need time to become solid before they can withstand other people's opinions of them. Clare had opinions the way some houses have drafts. Constant, coming from multiple directions, and impossible to fully block without sealing everything shut. The documentary filmmaker found Agnes in February, which she had not anticipated. He had been researching a civilian Cold War-era construction in the region for a project about a private preparedness culture, and the land transfer had apparently appeared in a public record search. His name was Tom Garrett. He was in his early 40s, and he emailed the address on file with the county registrar, which was Agnes's address, with a brief, respectful message that did not assume anything. She called him back the following morning. They met at the land on a Thursday in late February, Agnes arriving first and having the hatch already open when Tom pulled up in a car that suggested a limited documentary budget. He stood at the top of the steps and looked down and was quiet for a long moment, in the way that people are quiet when something is larger than they expected. "How long did it take him to build this?" Tom asked. 11 years, Agnes said. Tom looked at her. "And he left it to you?" "He left it to me." She let him film for 3 hours that day, with her permission and at her direction, and set 2 rooms as off-limits: the reading room and the section of shelving where Edward's personal items were stored. Those were hers. The rest he could have. Over the following 6 weeks, Tom brought in a structural engineer, a Cold War historian from the State University, and a preservation specialist, who assessed the concrete work with something approaching reverence. The engineer's report confirmed what Agnes had already understood from the manual and from her own observation. The construction was extraordinary. Reinforced to a standard well beyond civilian necessity, the drainage system alone represented months of individual labor. The ventilation designed with a precision that had kept the interior at a stable 52 degrees for over 4 decades without active climate control. The historian called it one of the most complete privately constructed civilian shelters of the period in the Northeast. He used the word remarkable 3 times in a single conversation. The preservation specialist put a figure to it: $340,000. As a documented historical site with intact contents. The kind of assessment that came with recommendations for conservation funding and potential listing on a regional heritage registry. Agnes wrote the number in her notebook in the same plain handwriting she used for everything else. She signed the documentary rights agreement in March at the kitchen table with a cup of tea beside her and Claire's last voicemail still unlistened to on her phone. She listened to it that evening. Clare had heard something, from whom Agnes could not determine, but information had a way of traveling along the routes people didn't notice until they were already traced. The voicemail was careful, its carefulness more revealing than directness would have been. Clare said she had heard Agnes had been spending time at the property, that she hoped Agnes was being sensible, that they should talk, that she'd been looking into this with a fresh perspective and thought perhaps there was something worth discussing after all. Agnes deleted the voicemail and called Clare back the next morning. "Come on Saturday," she said. "Come to the land. I'll show you." Clare drove out on a cold March Saturday, the sky clear for the first time in weeks. The birch trees at the far edge of the field beginning to show the first pale suggestion of new growth. Agnes was already there when Clare's car came down the gravel track. She had the hatch open. She was standing beside it with her hands in her coat pockets, and she watched her daughter cross the rough ground toward her with the careful expression of someone who has prepared several versions of a conversation and is not yet sure which one will be needed. Clare stopped a few feet away and looked at the open hatch, at the concrete surround, at the steps going down into light. Agnes had the lamp on below. "Ma'am," Clare said, and her voice had shifted, the careful tone replaced by something unguarded. "What is this?" "It's mine," Agnes said. "I know, but—" Clare moved toward the steps. "Can I—" "No." The word came out quietly, without anger, without drama. The way you state a fact that does not require elaboration. Clare stopped. She looked at her mother with an expression Agnes recognized. The same expression Clare had worn at 12 years old, when she had discovered the world contained rules she had not made and could not immediately renegotiate. "Edward built this," Agnes said, "over 11 years, alone, because he wanted one place that was entirely his own. He understood something about that, the need for it." She looked at her daughter steadily. "He left it to me for the same reason." "Mom, I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just want to see—" "I know what you want," Agnes said, not unkindly. "You want to assess it. You want to understand what it's worth and what to do with it and how it fits into the plan. That's how you are, Clare, and I don't say that badly. But this isn't part of the plan. This is mine. The assessment has already been done by people who know what they're looking at, and the number is $340,000. If you'd like, I'll send you the documentation." Clare stood very still. "The apartment," Agnes continued, "is also still mine. I would like it to remain so. I am 77 years old, and I am currently managing a documented historical property, negotiating a documentary rights agreement, and reading military engineering manuals in my spare time. I don't believe Sunrise Gardens is going to be necessary." The birch trees moved at the far edge of the field. Somewhere in them, a bird made a brief, declarative sound, and then was quiet. Clare looked at the open hatch for a long moment. Then she looked at her mother, and something in her face shifted. Not collapsed, not surrendered, but genuinely moved. The evaluating look was gone. What replaced it was older and less managed. "He really left you all this," she said quietly. "A stranger." He wasn't entirely a stranger. Agnes reached into her coat pocket and took out Edward's letter, the original, the one she kept on her person when she came to the land, the way you keep something close that has weight. She held it out. "You can read it. Once." Clare took it carefully. She read it standing in the cold field, the paper turning slightly in the wind. When she finished, she held it for a moment before giving it back, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "He watched your life," Clare said, "from a distance, the way some people do." "And he built you a—" Clare looked at the hatch again, shook her head slightly. "He built you a fortress." "He built himself one," Agnes said, folding the letter and returning it to her pocket. "He just had the sense to know he wasn't going to need it forever." They stood together in the field for a while after that, not talking, the silence between them warmer than it had been in months. Clare did not ask again to go below. Agnes did not offer. They drove to a roadside cafe on the county road and had lunch, and Clare asked questions about Edward, his military service, the engineering manuals, what the historian from the university had said, and Agnes answered them, finding that she had more to say on the subject than she had realized. Driving home alone that evening, west into the setting sun, Agnes thought about Edward Sorel dying at 89 in a house she had never visited, in a town she had never passed through, having spent 11 years building something in a field so that one person could be safe. She thought about the photograph on the wall of the reading room, her mother's garden gate in the background, the summer light on the face of a woman neither of them had known well enough, or long enough, or at all. She thought about the letter, the date on it, 2019, written when he was 87 and already knew what was coming. "I believe you will know what to do with a place that belongs entirely to you." She had known. She hadn't known she knew, not until she was standing in a cold field in November, pressing her boot against metal buried under leaves. But she had known. The city appeared ahead of her, its lights coming up through the dusk. Agnes drove toward it at a sensible speed, both hands on the wheel, the notebook on the passenger seat open to a new page, and thought about spring. The birch trees would be fully leaved by April. The solar panels would run longer days. She had found a reference in one of Edward's engineering texts to a secondary ventilation access she had not yet located, somewhere along the eastern wall, and she wanted to find it before the ground softened. There was still a great deal to do. She found she was looking forward to all of it.